Local programming on KRWG Public Media made possible in part by viewers like you. Thank you.
This is KRWG Public Media, TV, radio, online. News that matters. Now, across the Mesilla Valley and the borderland, the stories that shape our community. From the KRWG Broadcast Center at New Mexico State University, this is Newsmakers.
Welcome to Newsmakers. I'm Casey Counts. Thank you for joining us. Several organizations, including ProgressNow New Mexico, came together to criticize Governor Michelle Lujan Grisham's vetoes of several climate initiatives passed during this year's legislative session. They included measures to incentivize individuals to turn to products they can use in their everyday lives, to rely more on renewable energy and less on fossil fuels. It's no secret that the state is incredibly reliant on revenue from fossil fuels to pay for crucial services citizens depend on. ProgressNow New Mexico's Energy Policy Director, Lucas Herndon, joins us now to discuss what happened during the session and what New Mexico's energy future looks like. Welcome to KRWG Public Media.
Thanks, Casey. Glad to be here.
Why don't we start by having you tell us just a little bit about what ProgressNow New Mexico is and what its goals are?
Sure, thanks. ProgressNow New Mexico is the state's premier digital online communications hub for progressive politics. We have a focus on moving the conversation in the state around progressive politics, mostly on the online space, although we do sometimes have in-person events as well, especially during the legislature. We don't always just focus on energy. That's what I focus on, but I have colleagues that I work with that work on reproductive rights, democracy issues, voting rights issues, and anything that helps move the needle towards a better, more resilient future for all of the citizens in the state.
Give me a little bit of a picture of the different NGOs that did come together to speak out after the legislative session and how these groups work together to achieve their goals.
Sure. So in the environmental space in New Mexico, there are a number of organizations. Of course, you have some of the bigger national ones like Sierra Club, League of Conservation Voters, and those kinds of organizations. You also have some of the more regional outfits that work on things specifically in the western half of the United States, groups like the Western Environmental Law Center, the Western Resource Advocates, those kinds of groups. And then you have really smaller in-state groups that are more focused on very specific regional things like San Juan Citizens Alliance, and other groups like that. There's indigenous groups from various pueblos and tribal nations here on the state that work on environmental issues. There's a youth-led organization called Yucca. There are literally dozens, and everybody works on sort of different things. Everybody has different priorities, but when it comes to the larger goal of moving New Mexico away from fossil fuel reliance, we all share that goal. And so I think what we're talking about here today is how all those different organizations came together and have sort of spoken out with a united front on this issue in particular.
Let's talk about action that was taken during the legislative session by the legislature and the governor's response in terms of vetoes.
Well, sure. I think that's what's important for New Mexicans specifically to remember is that Governor Michelle Lujan Grisham campaigned last year on taking serious action on climate change, and in her messaging around that, it was a promise to continue that work, because in her first term she really did deliver on that. Her first action ever taken when she took the office back in 2019 was an executive order that was to move New Mexico's emissions goals into a place that would be more in line with international accepted levels of emissions, specifically on methane, and we achieved those goals under her first campaign. So under her first term. Under her first term. Mm-hmm. And so first of all, we need to remember that she campaigned on it, and then at the start of this year's session, during her State of the State address, she had a very specific line where she promised that she would take action on climate through the legislature this year, specifically on an emissions bill, meaning oil and gas wells here in the state produce a lot of greenhouse gases, and those greenhouse emissions affect everybody, not just in the state, but in the world. And so reining in what those emissions look like is a key goal that almost every environmental organization I can think of shares. When it comes to what happened during the legislature, unfortunately, we never did see that bill come out of her office and pushed through the legislature. Obviously, the way our system works is that a bill is introduced on the floor by, in the House or in the Senate. But the governor often has priority bills that everyone knows she has helped craft. Those bills, her climate bill never came to fruition. There were a number of other, I don't want to say the word smaller bills, but more specific, more focused bills that did come through the legislature this year. Some of those were included in a tax package that got rolled into the overall budget process, and those were the bills that got line itemed after the session was over by the governor.
Let's talk a little bit about what those initiatives would have done.
Sure. So there was one specifically for tax credits for buying electric vehicles. There was one for if consumers wanted to purchase heat pumps for their home. Heat pumps are an electric alternative towards traditional heating, like gas heating and cooling. So you could have gotten a tax credit if you'd installed that in your home. There were tax credits that would have allowed both residential users and commercial users to purchase renewable energy storage systems. So right now, a lot of folks that do have solar panels on their roof, like myself included, our systems are tied into the grid. So if there is a power outage, you still lose power even if you are, creating power from the sun. But the future is energy storage, batteries. But those batteries are still kind of on the expensive side. So having tax credits to encourage people to be able to buy those, store that energy, use it when and if there is a power shortage, especially on the industrial and commercial level, is a huge thing that we should be doing to move New Mexico, towards that renewable energy future. So all of those things that I just listed all had incentives based on tax credits that were in that tax package that were vetoed by the governor.
And the governor did express concerns that she just thought that the tax package was too big and would endanger solvency moving forward. Do you buy that argument?
Well, it's difficult for me to buy that argument because then, just a couple of weeks ago, she was in Washington, D.C. at a national energy summit put on by Politico. And at that summit, she actually said that she vetoed the incentives because they were too small and that they didn't do enough. And so it feels inconsistent for her to tell us here in the state that they were too big and that it threatened the solvency of the tax issue as a whole, but then to also then tell people on a national stage that they were too small. And so we're all a little baffled by that, actually. I think the issue is that the tax credits themselves were parts of things that she could carve out to ensure that the other pieces she did allow to pass through in that tax package could get done without threatening the political will behind those tax credits.
Is there any information regarding the governor's climate bill that never happened? Do we know what went wrong?
Nothing that I would feel comfortable saying out loud. There's a lot of speculation, of course. Politics can be something of a game to a lot of people. There's a lot of insider, horse trading, as they say. So lots of different feelings and things out there. What is known is that the oil and gas industry is the state's not just largest contributor, a single source contributor in terms of state revenue, but is also the single largest contributor to political donations to both parties. And that includes our Democratic governor. The vast majority of her campaign funds came from the oil and gas industry. And so it is, probably best left to just speculate, but we know that we know that she got those campaign contributions, and we know she vetoed these climate bills.
Where do you see New Mexico when and if it does make that turn away from its dependence on revenue from fossil fuels? How does the state survive?
Sure. And you know, something that we get sort of leveled at us a lot is that we want to destroy the oil and gas industry, and it's just not really true. We want a safe and clean fossil fuel industry, both for us as citizens that have to live in the state and drink the water and breathe the air, but also for the workers who actually physically are out there in the field. It can be a very dangerous and harmful environment for them, and so part of the environmental work we do is what we call a just transition. So it's not about destroying this industry that is so important to the state, but about creating a just transition for everybody involved, most especially the workers and families who rely on that industry in places like the Permian Basin. So for us, that looks like creating new, exciting, state-of-the-art jobs in not just renewable energy, but all kinds of resources. New Mexico last year, we started legalizing sales of recreational marijuana for adults, and we've seen huge windfall profits from that initiative. New Mexico is blessed to have the largest land port of anywhere in the world here at Santa Teresa, and so that economy that is still growing year over year is something that we can talk about. In fact, the wind turbines that come up from Mexico, more of those pass through the Santa Teresa port of entry every day than anywhere else in the world. New Mexico has the largest online, meaning in-place wind farm right now, and is about to have an even larger one when SunZia gets going. And we just saw the first contracted power purchase agreements out of California for that power to be shipped across the state. So these are real, tangible things that are occurring right now. So we don't even have to think that far into the future. And the issue is creating a world where oil and gas is a part of that economy rather than something that is so heavily relied upon.
Let's get back to the inaction on climate. And I know at least a couple of states are now facing lawsuits because of that lack of action. So what can you tell us about the role of the courts in terms of environmental and energy policy?
Yeah, exactly. So, I think a lot of folks here in the state will remember that a few years back there was a lawsuit brought on behalf of students in New Mexico. Yazzie versus Martinez was the name of the case. And at that time, activists took issue with the fact that New Mexico students were really suffering in the state and not getting the education that we think constitutionally they are promised. And so, based on the concept of that lawsuit and based on the inaction of both the legislature and the governor this year, we have now seen activists in the state bring up the same issue, that the state has a constitutional requirement to ensure that New Mexico is a place for us to live and raise our families, have safe water to drink, have safe air to breathe. And there are rules on the books already administratively through the Oil Conservation Division, the New Mexico Environment Department, for those things to happen, and they're just not, unfortunately. While in the last 4 to 5 years we have seen good, solid rules put in place when it comes to emissions and spills, those rules are just simply not being enforced at a level that is having an impact. And so, again, if the administration isn't going to take action, and if the legislature isn't going to provide us with the legal framework we need to have those protections in place, people are taking it into their own hands to use the courts to make sure that those things occur.
I want to talk a little bit about, you mentioned, even at your house, you lose power even though you have solar panels and you need to be able to store your energy. So you kind of touched on something I wanted to move on to next, and that's infrastructure for electrification. For people to buy electric vehicles, they have to feel comfortable that they're going to be able to get from point A to point B in an efficient manner. Where do you think the state stands on that infrastructure?
Yeah, thankfully at the federal level, we've actually seen a huge investment in that infrastructure through the Inflation Reduction Act and a couple of other different pieces of federal legislation. New Mexico is a thankful recipient of millions, if not billions of dollars focused on that kind of infrastructure development, and we're already starting to see some of that money come in. There has already been work on for instance, electric vehicle infrastructure, so that if you drive a vehicle that relies on being charged, you can not only charge it at your home, obviously, but around town. And in the next couple of years, it won't be long before we see those electric charging stations across the state, at least on major highways. And so that kind of infrastructure is already in place. And more and more, we're seeing the efficiency of electrification. And it's also a cost-saving issue, right? New Mexico is often maligned as being a poor state, and people really do sometimes struggle with their utility bills. I know a lot of people saw their electric bills and their gas bills go up pretty high this past winter, and all of those things are based on the fact that we have 100-year-old laws that affect all of us when it comes to how utility companies are regulated at both the state and federal level. One of the things about electrification is it's not just a revolution of technology, but it's a revolution in who owns and has access to power. And I mean that kind of as a joke, because it's both power in the sense of actual physical energy, but also power in making decisions for yourself. If I haven't paid an electric bill since 2013. It's been 10 years since I paid an electric bill. I had to make an initial upfront investment about that, but part of that was having the knowledge and education that if you live somewhere, you're always going to pay an electric bill and maybe a utility bill. So if you're always going to have that bill, but have the opportunity to make an investment for something like solar, you can use that budget for your household and then make it as an investment rather than something where you're sort of paying rent basically to an electric company. And as we move towards a more just and equitable future for everybody, I think, and I think it's a shared goal that power transition, energy transition, is part of that just transition for all of New Mexico.
I want to get back to wind energy. You mentioned that New Mexico is now home to the largest wind farm in the country, and not every environmental group is a big fan of wind energy. So where do our groups come down in terms of their support for that renewable energy source? Sure.
A lot of that is unfortunately based in just sort of a industry-wide misinformation. Is it true that wind turbines have an effect on the environment and specifically on wildlife and specifically like birds, for instance? Yeah, absolutely. Installing anything out in nature is going to have an impact on the environment. What we know is that the impact that fossil fuel emissions have on this planet and have had over the last 150 years since we started using fossil fuels is an existential threat to the entire planet. To every living thing. There is no world where the potential effects on a small population of some species of birds in some places is more of an issue than the larger impact on the entire planet when it comes to continued use of fossil fuels. And I'm sure that as technology continues to advance, we'll figure out better, safer ways. I know there's already some electronic measures put in place in some wind farms to, send out a signal ostensibly to keep bats and birds away from the turbine, fans as they're spinning. And again, like and just briefly to touch on the same thing with solar, I come from the public lands world. I used to work on the National Monument Campaign here. I love our public lands here in the state, and as a public lands user, I don't particularly like seeing big solar farms or big wind farms any more than I like to see oil derricks going up on our public lands. But again, knowing what the trade-off is, knowing how the future that I want for my daughter to live in a habitable world, it is worth making some of those sacrifices sometimes.
Let's move on to another item that didn't get done during the legislative session, and that was a research facility for geothermal energy. I wanted to touch on that briefly just because it's not something we hear a lot about in terms of our renewable energy sources. We hear a lot about solar and a lot about wind, and not so much about geothermal energy. Where are we in terms of that being available to people?
Yeah, absolutely. And And the geothermal one was really interesting because that bill was separate from the other tax packages that were actively vetoed. Unfortunately, the governor pocket vetoed that one, basically just didn't sign that law into law after it had been passed unanimously by the legislature and with support of the oil and gas industry. So that one's really leaving us scratching our heads because it doesn't make sense. But yeah, geothermal is a really cool, not unexplored, but untalked about technology when it comes to renewable energy. For viewers who maybe are unfamiliar, the idea is you harness the heat underneath the earth, under the mantle, and you send fluid, water, but with a couple of other things added to it. You send it down into the earth, let it get heated up underground, and then it comes back up, and that heated water is then used in the same way that artificially heated water is currently used in power plants. So right now we use fossil fuels through natural gas, oil, coal, or nuclear to heat water up and then capture the steam to spin turbines. That creates the energy. We can do that with naturally occurring heat under the ground. It is geographically limited, and fortunately, New Mexico is blessed to have a lot of places that we can tap into that. There is one facility in the southwestern part of the state, down in the Boot Heel, that's working on this. The technology to do this exists, and actually, one of the reasons the oil and gas industry supports this is their drillers, the guys who are talented enough to know how to drill down into the ground and access the resources down there, they can be brought into this. So this could be part of our just transition in terms of the economy goes. As they say, we have the technology.
Well, let me ask you about water use in that form of energy production as compared to fracking. It can take somewhere between 2 and 12 million gallons of water in a fracking well. Do you know how geothermal would compare?
I couldn't tell you the amount, but what I can tell you is that geothermal is a closed loop system. And so you would have a closed loop, meaning the water that is inside of your pipe, let's say it starts with a tank of cold water, which is then pumped down into the ground, heated up, comes back up, turned into steam, spins the turbines. That steam is then captured, recondensed, that water is reused. You have a loss rate of just a few percent, I think, over time. Whereas with fracking, as you're noting, that requires huge amounts of constantly needed new water. And unfortunately, in the state of New Mexico, one of the things we don't have a law for is where that water comes from. And so oftentimes, fresh water is used up in the San Juan Basin. Navajo Lake, has been threatened for years because of use from the fracking industry.
I want to move on to the recent leasing of thousands of acres of land to the oil and gas industry. There was a recent protest at the BLM office against that move. How do you characterize that particular release of leases, and do you think it would be damaging?
Yeah, I think, again, any time we release pristine land that is untouched or being utilized by the public or even the private sector for traditional uses, and we turn that over to the oil and gas industry, it is a fundamentally damaging thing. The fossil fuel industry is by definition extractive. They are extracting something out of the industry or out of the earth, and it is often tried, that it's coming from under the ground, but you're also talking about hundreds of miles of dirt roads that are built, well pads, concrete is poured, storage tank batteries, pipelines, not to mention increased traffic dust. It's a hugely polluting and damaging sector of our industry right now, of our economy, and the protest of those public lands from that was federal public lands is I think a righteous thing. The oil and gas industry bought up more land in New Mexico specifically before and during COVID at the end of the Trump administration than they are currently actively using and drilling on. And so there really isn't a reason for them to continue to lease more land, they already are in possession of a bunch of land they're not using.
Well, let's talk about, we've focused really on state action so far. Let's talk a little bit about the role of the federal government. And obviously many would say that this is a role for governments all around the world, probably our biggest collective action problem that faces us today. Tell me a little bit about where you think our federal government is on making progress.
Well, unfortunately, it feels kind of like 2 steps forward, 1 step back. You know, we did see the passage of the Inflation Reduction Act, and we have seen some movement at the administrative level when it comes to things like the EPA and the Environmental Protection Agency, as well as the Bureau of Land Management. You know, we've seen movement. And just last week, we saw a meeting happen where the Bureau of Land Management was talking about a new rule where land can be leased not just by things like industry or by ranchers, but by conservation groups who want to do restoration projects, which is great. That is a good thing. But then just yesterday, we saw the debt ceiling crisis sort of balloon into this very typical logjam in Washington, D.C., and unfortunately, a big victim of that debate was the environment. We saw it through the passing, the approval of Senator Manchin's pipeline in West Virginia, also rollbacks of funding that was already put in place for things like the EPA. So, you know, that's going to be something we have to sort of claw back after this next round of, you know, changes. So, yeah, 2 steps forward, 1 step back, but I suppose that's true with most things in politics.
It certainly is in policy, of course. Lucas Herndon, Energy Policy Director for ProgressNow New Mexico, thank you so much for your time.
Yeah, thanks, Casey. Thanks for having me.
And that's our time for now. Join us this week on KRWG Radio. Every weekday, it's Morning Edition from 5 a.m. to 9, Fresh Air at 11, followed by Here and Now from noon to 2, and All Things Considered from 4 to 7. KRWG News is always online at krwg.org, and we'd like to hear from you. Email us with story ideas and video submissions. The address is feedback@nmsu.edu. For all of us at KRWG News, I'm Casey Counts. Have a great week, and we'll see you next time on Newsmakers.